Two things come to mind. Of course, there's the idea of, you mentioned the black evangelical, which is very different from, I would say, even the evangelical left, and the evangelical right, and white evangelicalism. But even white evangelicalism is, that's not even a monolithic term. Having said that, what are your thoughts on, for example, and then there's like, for example, the charismatic movement. Are the charismatic, is that an evangelical movement? As we're kind of throwing things out there, what are your thoughts?
Well, I spent too much time thinking about that question, so thanks for asking it. I've often wondered, it feels like it's a self-identifying term. This might sound a little off topic at the start, but I think it gets to this, how am I thinking about it? When Barack Obama, whose mother was white and whose dad was African, defines himself and explained why he chooses to define himself as an African American, he said, because the way I experience the world is as an African American, not based on my heritage, but based on my lived experience. So he doesn't even primarily describe himself as someone with, from mixed race. He would say, my experience is, so I identify as a black man in the United States. And I think that's what he should do, and I totally agree. That's his call, and that's how I experienced him as well. So that I think is a way to talk about evangelical. If people choose to identify as evangelical, as the way we should understand it, as opposed to saying, well, are you actually one or not? And try to come up with a definitional boundary of if you are one. I think it's an opt-in social category. You could say, no, I identify myself as an evangelical. Now, just as happens in other complex issues of people choosing a social identity, there are people who've said to Barack Obama and say to anybody who's choosing a social location, well, I don't agree that you should take on that experience, right? You're not black enough for me, right? Okay, well, that's I think what we're experiencing in the evangelical space, and I think there's an awful lot of people that are just saying like, this thing is not good enough to fight over. Like I feel like I'm haggling at a garage sale over a 25-cent cord. Like I don't even want it. And they're honestly, just as there are people at a garage sale who just at some point they don't want the cord. They just want to win the bid. There's people in evangelicalism, they're just fighting for it because they just want to win. There's no doubt in my mind about that. I interact with these people all the time. I'm like, wow, that's a different energy. I'm not trying to win. I'm just saying I'm going to use it because I think it represents the social location for white evangelicals, if the numbers are right, I don't know that they are, I'm really suspect of them, but they talk about there being 100 million in the United States. So when they say something like 80% of white evangelicals, they're meaning 80 million. I'm super interested in that 20 million. I know it's not as many as 80, but I like the notion of a remnant. And if we can move 20 million to 25 million or 30 million, it's enough to start to move public opinion because I think there's a lot of energy in that space. So there's lots of reasons why I think as a social category, I want it to stay around and be available to everyone and not just some. But I think it's an argument around who decides the categories. And does somebody feel that they are the gatekeeper? And there are a lot of people, you mentioned a number of them, who really do believe that their job is to be the gatekeeper. And what they really also mean is true Christian. Now, I don't want to overstate their opinion, but there's some people for whom evangelical and true Christian are synonyms. So when they're arguing for what does it mean for someone to be an evangelical, they're really meaning what does it mean for someone to be a true Christian. And I've already outed myself. I don't make that fight because I also think that's a self-identifying term, right? So, and I don't think it matters because I think it's just a social construct. So I think that's some of what's going on.
Follow up, sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's very interesting. You talked about the idea it's an American concept, right? It seems very American because I know from my parents, they're both Christians, and they come from like the Chinese-speaking Christian community. And the word for the evangelical Christians, in Chinese, 福音派, which is福音means it means gospel. So the gospel, and then there's charismatic, 灵恩派, and then there's the conservatives. So there's actually a distinction for them between the conservative Christians, which is also a pirate. So that's like, maybe like the Presbyterian, but to them, the Presbyterians would belong in that, of course, from in China or in Taiwan. So there's for them, there's a distinction between, there's evangelical would be like people who focus on the Bible, teaching about the Bible, And then the charismatic, that would be like people who emphasize like healing and, power encounters. And, the conservative, they would just be, people who are more, keeping with the tradition. So I don't know, it's just an interesting contrast. Whereas in America, evangelical seems much more encompassing, which is like I would say most charismatics would probably identify as evangelical in some way, perhaps. I don't know. But I don't know, it's just interesting kind of contrast.
That is so helpful, and that's, I think, really illustrative of the fact that these terms and categories might carry from culture to culture, but are funded differently, have a different imagination behind them. There was a period of time where I think that kind of explanation was the experience in the United States. The neo-evangelicals of the 1940s and 1950s in the United States were really trying to contrast away from the social liberals and the social fundamentalists, and they were trying to be this middle space on a social set of categories. So they were going to say, well, we're not going for all that social gospel stuff of changing society, and we're certainly not going to become fundamentalists. We're going to instead have another set of topics that we unite around, the Bible and faith and these kinds of things. And that was how it was pitched by some of them, and others immediately were in discussion about that, or argument about that, saying, no, I don't know that that's how it goes. It has been an ongoing discussion across religion for the last 150 years. I totally would have thought it would have expired by now. And it just seems to be,
let me comment on that, because I think one of the other things that we've not mentioned here are the parachurch groups and the educational institutions that have had a major role in perpetuating the term by, appropriating that term for their institutions. And if we didn't have that National Association of Evangelicals, if we didn't have seminaries that identifies, if we didn't have like journals that have evangelical in the name of them, and all these institutional expressions with this moniker in them, we might have we might have seen the decline of the use of the term and the rise of other terminology. So I think one of the things that we understand this about different faith communities too. So I know in Baptist history, Baptist work kind of expanded all over the country, and Florence too, with American Baptist Convention too. Baptist work went everywhere, but where it flourished was where there was also institutions of higher learning, higher education that grew up at the same time as congregations did. And so I think these, and then the emphasis I think of within evangelicalism for emphasis on college ministries, and Young Life High School ministries and things like this, the evangelism of evangelical congregations took them into places that created a pipeline. So what helps something exist are institutional expressions and generational expressions. And so, that becomes a part of the way in which, like you said here, okay, I'm kind of stuck with that term, or, it's applied to me, it's the history I've come out of, and so how do I wear it into the future? And so I think that the understanding of what creates, especially in our society with so many things changing, what creates sustenance for a community, and those bonds are more, they're kind of tenuous. So you wonder, okay, if a seminary hadn't declared themselves evangelical, that they were sort of declaring their market, and they were going to draw from these churches, or we're going to do this. And so this idea of self-identification is important, but also this idea of how we institutionalize terminology for our definitions. I do think one of the great contributions to American Christianity right now is the beautiful engagement of ethnic communities of all kinds, taking the diaspora from other countries. I mean, one of the main for CDF right now is global migration, you know, intersecting with communities, because there's everything from climate refugees to, you know, refugees from conflict, or refugees from all kinds of communities all around the world. And what that is bringing, just as you explained, definition and understanding, I think we've gained so much from the perspective of these of other cultures and ethnicities in the expression. And so even within our denominational structures, like Florence is over multicultural, intercultural ministries within her denomination, I mean, that pipeline of information and maybe fertilizer, if we're thinking of this as an ecosystem, you know, what is growing new because of this? And so retrieving the term, reconciling the term, maybe resurrecting a new, you know, expression that has. I mean, I think there's some other R words we might think of.
That's pretty interesting.
Could you tell us who you are? And then...
Oh, my name is Sam Coe. So it was kind of funny because Young would laugh at this. About a year ago, we were rebranding our name, and our name had institute in it. We're like, that was then. And you're talking about rebranding. The funny thing is, when we got together, we came out with all kinds of ideas. Remember, Young? And some of them were really bad. But we kept on coming together and thinking, and all of a sudden, how about innovative space? And everybody was like, oh my gosh. You know, from institute to innovative, and yet we still didn't lose our identity, because that was what we're doing. I'm thinking, Suzii, you know, I would think that would be so cool if there were a gathering of big time guys where we just came together and said, hey, this is so important, we're gonna need to possibly rethink or recoin, you know, this word evangelicalism, and maybe come up with something like that. I don't know. I mean, I'm just thinking through, because it seems like it's such a big deal. It's like a big enough deal where I feel like it needs to have some kind of traction, have some kind of word out there where, hey, is there something that we could do even to rebrand us? You know, I don't know. I mean, it's just thought that just came on out.
I'm doing a bit of work on that, not so much what's the group of people. I mean, I do that with organizations, because that's a close group of people and sort of a marketing deal. But the lexicon in a society, that's owned by everyone. Like how words sort of move about a lexicon. You only have use of the term phone for one of these.
Yeah.
So they went to the iPhone, or Sam's. I'm just where functional.
Progressive evangelicalism is as legitimate of a social religious movement as anything else, and it deserves a good old boring institute to talk about what it does, and it's not a self-defined group of progressive evangelicals. It's not a club. It is a group it's an institute, a think tank, that studies and talks about the existence of and the experience of the progressive evangelical experience right now in North America.
And is it an open dialogue where people can come into that?
No, it's a closed institute that has like fellows and that kind of stuff, right? So no, it's not a catch-all sort of come one, come all, convener neighborhood or meetup group. It is a think tank where people have, like, we are doing really specific kind of boring-ish things. But to your
That's
point,
cool, though.
like
That's really
trying
cool.
to get,
Yeah.
sometimes the legitimacy, it's basically, if things don't get counted, they don't count. Right? So we count things that tend to count in our society. This is one of the social ramifications that we've realized in society, right? And it was why people understanding, Jeff, as you said, like your Asian experience is really important because you want to make sure that doesn't get lost and it gets counted. It's one of the reasons why we don't count police shootings in this country, because we don't want them to count. So we don't count them. And if you don't count something, it's because in your society it doesn't, and at some point you won't even notice it anymore. I mean, churches do this all the time, by the way. Like, they count certain sets of things, really interestingly, like how many people showed up and how much money we got and how many minutes over a lot of time we went. There's a whole other set of things we don't count that really matter to people, like in their just sort of lived life, but we don't tend to count them. How many people are here today with what feels like a broken heart? We don't tend to count that. Hey, we had 17 people in here that were on the verge of tears today because their heart was sort of saddened. That really matters to a church. Like, churches should put that up on the little wooden thing, you know, the broken heart number.
Is that
How
a
many?
hymn number?
What's that?
Is that a hymn number?
Yeah, is that a hymn number instead of a hymn
How
number?
many
Right?
meaningful relationships were formed?
Yes.
Yeah.
How many relationships were reformed? How many people? How many people woke up today and said, "I think I know what my life's about"? There was one. I mean, people would love to come back and just find out if next week there was another. Like, some really important things, but we tend not to count. So anyway, all of that to say, I think we need to count. So we started a boring old institute that'll do things like write papers and count people and argue about definitions. Because what's happening in evangelicalism right now, just sort of on a landscape, is it's borrowing if I could borrow a phrase from you, it's hyper-conservatives fighting with mostly conservatives, fighting with somewhat conservatives, fighting with just plain old conservatives. And if you're not in one of those versions of a conservative kind of evangelical, you're just sort of left out. So we're just want to be in the flow so that other 20 million doesn't become, or 20% isn't just, that's the ignored
Invisible,
20%.
They're the invisible evangelicals.
The invisible evangelicals.
And another
That's us, we put on those
another new term.
Doug, I didn't know that. That's really cool to know that you guys are doing that. And by the way, boring is the new cool, if you haven't noticed.
Thank you. We're banking on that. So.
I hadn't heard that.
Yeah,
that sounds
because,
great.
Yeah.
I need that for myself, so
Yes.
I'm going to take that.
Yeah. Tesla CEO Elon Musk, boring company, right?
Yep.
That's the new cool, right? So.
That's a hard one to wrap my mind around. I want to go to some other folks who have questions, so please tell us who you are. And
I'm Florence. I work for American Baptist. Being an Asian woman, serving, I want to go back to my root, you know, as an Asian American woman, you know, so all that back into it. I think that, you know, the way that evangelical is definitely a category that when I grew up, when I really encountered, by the time when I came from a Christian family, but the experience I have back in Hong Kong in high school is when Billy Graham came to Hong Kong. That day, the principal, she's British, in Episcopal high school, shut down the whole school. The whole school go down to Hong Kong Stadium to hear Billy Graham.
Wow, that's cool.
So that was my first encounter of evangelism. You know,
That's cool.
and throughout the years, then I will say, this evangelism really brought by Euro-American centric theology. You know, and that is very deep rooted in China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and all Southeast Asia and South Asia. Okay, so the diaspora you mentioned that you know it's not only in South Asia, but I think in Latin America the same way, and that's why the liberation theology it's so important for us in this era to find out what is our culture and identity.
You know, to shift. I love Billy Graham, but I blame Billy Graham. You know, as the Asian culture, because Christianity, as you say, that from my experience, that when I turned into a Christian, my mom was disowned me because you go against your culture and identity of ancestor worship.
That's right.
So you have to abandon your culture. But, well, through the years that you go back and you love your culture. I can be a Chinese, I can be a Christian too, you know. So I can eat the food on the order my mother offered. No guilt about it, you know. But I think that for Asian American churches, the movement of evangelical is too building up too exclusive for a larger community. Not talking about the political side of it, but then the faith and the expression side of it. Because for Asian American churches that I work with, and I have, you know, experience with all this encounter, that the perspective of Asian American theology is, I would not say the term narrow, but it's because it's too defined by Christianity of mission era. Okay, and so that's why we put ourselves into evangelical category, and it's hard to fly out of that cocoon. You know, so, and that impacting the Asian American not to be social activist or politically savvy. You know, so when we go...
Say more about that. How do you make that connection between locating
Because-
oneself in evangelicalism and then not being politically engaged and savvy?
Well, so because evangelical, they're equal to born again movement, and equal to, you know, being exclusive. You're not born again, you're not the true Christian. Okay?
So the central question is more about in and out and not about these other things.
Yeah.
Okay.
See, when we draw the circle that I'm evangelical, that circle, you're also excluding other people, and you also exclude yourself from the outer circle. Okay? So once the Asian American, I work with 25 different ethnic group of Asian, from Naga to Burmese to Chinese and all that. So, but we all have a common ground, a very, you know, a strong Christ-centered, Christ-centric gospel-like theology, you know, and I really appreciate this is the deep-rooted Christian faith that Asian Americans have. But however, you know, over time, because of the historical history of Christianity that interfiltered into generation before we came, you know. So anyway, to make it short, I wrote down a couple of notes. Is that I'm using a strong word, hold hostage. Asian American Christianity is being held hostage. Okay, not until that Asian American, you know, generation to come, willing to find the identity and the culture and blend in what is true evangelical. Because we do, no matter how you define how wide it is, you know, we do have some connection that common ground in this. But oftentimes that our circle is smaller than we thought. So we need to enlarge the circle.
What are you hearing in what Florence is saying about the Asian American experience of evangelicalism and then the circles that we're in together?
You know, I'm really struck by her comment about Billy Graham and this Western aggression influence, and that, and her term of being held hostage. And I think that the great freedom construct of our time is the release and the growth beyond those shackles. And I do think that I was sitting here thinking, even before you spoke, about evangelicalism as a historical term from the very predominantly white, sort of patriarchal time in our history. And that as that time fades, this construct also loses its potency and relevance. And so, I mean, I'm hearing that, that strong terminology of held hostage, knowing there's all kinds of blindnesses and all kinds of privileges that have rimmed in and held people in painful, hurtful walls. And that the work of deconstructing that is not just language or terminology, but is also a great call for true community, partnership, and learning. And so it just echoes so many other things that are happening right now. Hashtag Me Too. I mean, hashtag the global voices. And so that's one of the things I'm hearing here that strikes me so much is this story of imposition that we have to take responsibility for laying down.
Yeah. I think, you know, I'll keep my position here and just to share that intimately that the Asian Americans has such a beauty, you know, diversity, you know, and we, just like Latinos, that we don't want the people to define us with one term, one category of Asian American. But because we do, within Asian American Latino, we do have multi-ethnic, and each culture have their own expression. And I think that theology-wise, we need to discover that more, you know, and say more and write more and do more, you know. And I think that will complement what is evangelism. And going back to Matthew 28,
Yes.
that you go out to all nations, but not with exclusive, you know.
Yeah, that's.
It's
can
much
I make a
more
comment on-
artistic endeavor
Yes.
than an endeavor
beautiful.
of structure.
That's beautiful, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing is so common. If I can read into it a bit, it sounds like what happened when Billy Graham came was there was a kind of Christianity that was presented as if it was culturally neutral and just true. And without recognizing, hey, I'm Billy Graham from the United States, and here's been my experience, and this is what I'm seeing, this is how I've experienced God. All of that gets stripped away, and this has been an evangelical fault line, but it's also been the fault line of non-evangelical Christian traditions to do the same thing. Like, we're just bringing the pure, unadulterated gospel. We stripped everything else away, almost like the gospel is the orange, and you peel away the peeling on the outside, and it's just the fruit. As it turns out, it's shaped much more like an onion, that it's a series of peelings, and you keep peeling away, and you realize it was always social construct, right? So rather than you being able to tell the story that the book of Acts tells us in chapters 9 and 10, when Peter, follower of Jesus, has a cross-cultural experience with a Gentile and goes into the home of Cornelius, he goes into that home in this artistic and says, I was having an experience on my roof. You were having a vision in your prayer time. We're separated by culture and we've been made enemies of one another. What is it that you have for me? And Cornelius tells his story, and Cornelius says, and what is it that you have for me? And there becomes an exchange. And that story of the conversion in Acts chapter 9 is not the story of the conversion of Cornelius alone. It's the story of the conversion of Peter, who then Peter says, I now see how true it is that God does not show favoritism. There was a true exchange that happened. That's not what I was hearing was the experience for you and for your. Instead, it was a one-way imposition, not a mutual exchange of conversions.
Right.
And that's so I push a little bit that I don't think what was going on there should be called some sort of biblical narrative. I think you have to call it what it was, which it was an American export of a religious tradition. to another country. Well, that's fair enough, that happens too. And then let's name that, well, that didn't go so well, maybe next time this could go a little differently. And instead it calcifies and the story gets retold. So this is where, as a, like somebody who thinks that the biblical narrative keeps showing up and that history kind of moves in this beautiful swirling pattern, that it's this wonderful experience where we can say, boy, that's not the way it needed to go. That we have other stories that can counter that story. And this is maybe next time we should try it like this. And so any of us who want to engage with others in some sort of mutuality, I don't think we're trapped only with the Presbyterian story or the Lutheran story or the Orthodox story or the evangelical story. I think that's the beautiful thing about having a biblical narrative that can say to us, wow, that felt an awful lot more like a conquering narrative than it felt like a story kind of tendency. That's why I'm somebody who wants to hold to, let's utilize the biblical narratives where it can, because there's an awful lot of really rich tradition there without it becoming so dominating. So
Thank you.
That's shared.
I saw a couple questions here. I see a lot of questions now. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Tell us who you are, and then go ahead.
I'm Josephina, and I really appreciate her comments because I did feel a lot of affinity to it. I'm speaking as a first-generation Latina. My parents are both from Puerto Rico. My grandfather was a horseback riding minister, going from church to church on Sunday mornings to preach. And so I think that my mother had a conversion story with the Billy Grahams, and the television called her to her knees. And not throwing away the baby. It made it very confusing to listen to theology that was very much evangelical and very proud to be evangelical and wanted to evangelize the whole world, because we're on that commission to do that. But the contradiction for me was that there was no freedom in Christ. Everything was sin, and men were supposed to run the world, and women were subordinate. And then we find ourselves having these conversations about free pulpits, but we weren't, as Latinas, indoctrinated to understand the fuller picture of this freedom or this liberation. And like the Asian traditions and all the diversity in it, we also have over 20-something Spanish-speaking countries. And we don't even count that as Latinos when we say that. And this country. So we have many, many Latinos in this country. And they always say, we have Mexico and my country. I was born in Massachusetts, and I'm Josefina Perez. So those contradictions are very complicated. Christianity has been hijacked for Latinos. And also emotions are intermingled, right? We appreciate that God loves us and that Christ came and laid down his life for us, and we are supposed to do everything unto death because we can do all things through Christ, including die and resurrect. But we serve this evangelism to the point of deep despair and suffering and damage in our communities.
Oh yeah, what's up guys? Jason Chu. I'm a musician. Yeah, I think Florence and Josephina, like I really love where the conversation is at and really the direction that you said it in. Because throughout this whole last hour and a half, what's been running through my mind is the question, or is the idea that we need to name and extricate evangelical, or not even evangelicalism, but Christianity in the Western Hemisphere from whiteness. And I think that, and that's been inherent or behind, unspoken in a lot of what we've said for the last hour and a half. But I think it's interesting that it takes so long even to work our way around to it, to naming it so boldly. Because, as I think about the proximal conversation, right, is evangelicalism, retrieve or retract. But it's so interesting, right, because, and we're taking care to say, oh, it's white evangelicalism that did this or that. But the interesting thing is, right, we rarely in public discourse see the phrase Black evangelicalism, or Asian American evangelicalism, or Latina evangelicalism. In fact, I would even say with press coverage and the way media is, you can effectively substitute in common language white evangelicalism for evangelicalism.
That's right.
Right? The spokespeople. We all saw what happened when Lecrae said that Black Lives Matter. All of a sudden, right? The Black evangelicalism gets it. They're still behind. And, you know, Black people who identify as evangelical or born again, still ride with it. But then it is unfortunately, white evangelicals and a lot of Asian American evangelicals who now suddenly say, oh, that wasn't what I meant by it. So, you know, I think that we're kind of playing self-assuaging games to say that there's a difference between evangelicalism and white evangelicalism. We can split our own hairs and it can make us feel better, which is not a bad thing. But as we ask these questions about retrieve, or I wonder if there's a bigger issue, unspoken, and I think we all are probably already know that it's there, but I want to name that even if we retract, right, if we find, if it's progressive Christianity, or it's active Christianity, or whatever we want to call it, how do we not just rebuild the same thing, right? Because evangelicalism has gone the way of fundamentalism, of born again. How do we make sure that we're not just reconstructing something that becomes, again, white-dominated, male-dominated? You know?
So let me piggyback on that, and I want to put this question to both of you. Many of us have found that it was a rude awakening to find that perhaps there was never really space for Asian Americans within what we call evangelicalism here in the Western Hemisphere. And that came about in a number of ways, especially in election year 2016. But the number of times that pulpits were silent on issues of justice really affected so many of us, and not just Asian Americans, but especially our Black brothers and sisters, and then the rest of us as well who are attuned to these issues. So finding that there perhaps was never really genuine space for Asian Americans, I want to hear about the work that you're doing, your encounters with Asian Americans, or the hope that you see, or the challenges that you've experienced in reaching out to Asian Americans, how you do your learning, how you are interfacing with other populations that maybe are not represented within your organizations. So talk about that a little bit, and as well as Jason's question. I think there's one more question. So go ahead, Suzii.
Well, let me talk and speak a minute about that. But speaking of our community in general, and gosh, there's so much to unpack here, but the intentional investment to deconstruct and interface and listen and hear starts in two locus of control centers, at the same time within a community of faith, I think. First of all, the individual leaders that, when you're speaking about voices of leaders, and this is where this, white evangelicalism, white Christianity, this deconstruction of our whole understanding. I mean, what that takes within my community is actual intentional work. So for 2 years, we have begun that work just first within our staff. So one locus of control is, okay, we can't lead an organization to even be open to hear, to see the beautiful and to understand it until we do the work ourselves. So within our staff to begin to do that, with intentional learnings, with our confronting our own racist histories, with renegotiating narratives of historical space, of weeping over Japanese internment, of spending time with tears and brokenheartedness, understanding and being in solidarity with women, Latina women, striving to minister with no place, and then helping a Latina Leadership Institute, helping young women start ministries of their own so that they have empowerment. I mean, we have to actually do these things as a community. So there's this locus of control, and it is intentional and beautiful work. And it's not just hosting a one-day conference or, writing an article or, saying such and such professor represents us. It is, just has to be much more detailed than that. So a part of our commitment and part of our leadership from my leadership as executive coordinator and as our governing board as CDF is to do this work and invest in it. And so secondly, I think the other locus of control is this whole cultural intersection that comes from both global and local church. And and this breath of the Holy Spirit that comes through a wave of awareness. Isn't it amazing how much can be dropped in a day? How much can be, I'm a labyrinth walker. That's one of my spiritual practices. One of the things I love about walking and praying the labyrinth is walking in this direction. And then in one step, you take a turn and you're facing the completely opposite direction. What a gift of life that we can do that. That we can be wholly different people. We can see a wholly different thing. We can sing a wholly different song. We can cry wholly different tears one day to the next. So, I mean, to embrace, I will say, our work has been done mostly in black and white spaces in CBF life. And we're working right now in Latino spaces and with Hispanic congregations because one of our structures, how do we do that as an organization? How do we do that as a community of churches? So we have come up with kind of a template of how we do that. We have one person who is a networker who is bringing in people from the outside to the inside. And then we have one person on the inside who's negotiating all the inside barriers that are here and helping us see them and reframe them. And then, so that has been, and then how do we provide a welcoming space that is truly welcoming and is not asking, a Hispanic congregation to compromise, but to be truly welcome? How are we preparing for that? So we're doing that as an organization, as a community of faith, with intentionality. And so in the Asian American space, I mean, we're just beginning that, of looking into this. We've had a lot of experience with Asian congregations globally, and what the beauty that's come to us from that in China and in Indonesia and the Philippines and Cambodia and Thailand. I mean, we've had these wonderful international experiences that have changed our congregations. And I believe this, that the whole, and speaking of evangelical culture, the whole mission trip culture that we've experienced as evangelicals, one of the great gifts to the church is a lot of our people have been in other places and served alongside of people they learned to love. So I think that God has prepared people with international experience for this moment. So that, like in that labyrinth, that experience is ready to help them make a turn, to turn in a different way. And so that's our, just how to be intentional as a group, how to create, and it costs money. And so you say, we're going to use our money for this. We're gonna do this instead of that, and make an intentional work of embracing a larger community.
Yeah, a couple of comments. Sure. Thank you for all that. It's really so exciting. Nearly 80% of white Protestants voted for Donald Trump. Nearly 80% of Catholics voted for Donald Trump. 80% of religious people, for whom religion's a primary organizing part of their life in the United States, voted for Donald Trump. It's true of evangelicals. It's also true of those other groups. What makes it newsworthy is that two things. One, it's a huge group, evangelicals. And secondly, it didn't seem like they should. It seemed like for a whole number of years, it was a bit of a shock factor. Like for all these years, they're like, the person matters, integrity matters, and the fact that they're just sellouts. But so are all the other religious traditions. African American churches, that's not true. I don't know about Asian communities, how they were calculated, maybe you know.
Or whether they were.
Or whether they were counted.
Yeah.
And I think that's the issue, is they weren't even counted probably as a religious community per se. So that's more back to the counting question of earlier. So I think that's worth noting, generally speaking. And to your comments earlier, they're so helpful. I will say, so I have a church in Minneapolis I'm part of, and I operate an organization called Greater Things that does this Evangelical Institute and a lot of other particular work. And we're a small nonprofit shop. I will say my experience, what I want my experience and the experience of Greater Things to be with the Asian American Christian community is that we can tell, I can talk about, in our organization, we talk about the experience of white evangelicals. And maybe that experience of progressive white evangelicals could be useful for people in Asian evangelical communities who are trying to figure out what do they do in light of their community. I am very hesitant to try to suggest that it's my role to create some space that engages with Asian Americans. It might have no interest at all. Like, it's certain, there's no expectation. I don't know, maybe they don't care at all about sort of what that experience is. What I can do is say that when I get invited into a space like this, and I feel like I get to be invited into Cornelius's house, and to say, God spoke to you to use the parable from that story, God spoke to you in a vision? Well, here was mine, what is yours? And what do they have to do with each other? Maybe there's some exchange here. That, I think, is the call that we should offer one another. And I'm interested in turning up the volume for all of us on what has been our experience with one another, so we can find those places of exchange. I don't feel like I operate any kind of and I'll tell you what, like in the evangelical world, I carry no power. I mean, I may have a tiny bit of influence, but there are all kinds of systems that have a whole lot more power. I don't think those systems that have power are under anyone's control. I think they're totally out of control, and they've just become powers and principalities that need. So there might be, if enough, a little redemption. If enough of us started working, I think it can. We use the phrase in Greater Things that Greater Things, my organization, wants to be a small hinge that opens a big door. And that's a really great imagery that my friend Samir suggested to me, the way that hinge on a door swings open a big door. There's a big door that's a big problem. And if all of us could become a series of hinges on that door, just swing it open, that's far more interesting to me as someone who feels like, I'm sort of running in the edges of evangelicalism anyway. I mean, most people will just not even think progressive evangelicalism for white people is a real thing. And if it is a real thing, who cares, right? It gets one of those two responses, like, yeah, not really, or really, don't really care. That's sort of the two responses. And I'm absolutely comfortable with that. That old edict that says, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they understand you, then they respect. That's fine. I don't mind being in the laughed at. There's a whole lot of people who are ignored and laughed at, and I'm glad to be in the category. So I guess my simple answer to that question is, if you take the horizontal category, the vertical categories that make our different religious traditions, and you say that there's also these horizontal categories that go across, I'm really interested in those horizontal connections that cross all of these. And so I think it's happening in Latino churches. It's certainly happening in African American. There's a lot of African American historic African American church people that would say, whoa, I'm far more progressive than the historic African American churches. If you've been around those communities, you know there is a lot of hesitation in progressivism, especially around full inclusion of all peoples, and not just LGBTQ people, but look, most people that go to churches are connected to or married to someone who doesn't hold to the faith of the person who attends that church. Like, if churches could just accept people who don't believe as full participants in their community, that would be a big deal just right there. And keeping atheists and humanists and non-believers out, it goes right along with keeping gay, lesbian, transgender people out, goes right along with keeping all the other peoples out. A lot of our religious traditions spend more time keeping most people out. Like, most people cannot even be part of most churches. That's just the weirdest thing in the world to me, but that's just generally true, that something's going to get you kicked out of the club.
Yep, please.
So my name is Ken. My name is Ken, and I'm not representing any organization I work for. I'm representing myself. But the question I have is, being one who thinks missionally about life and about missions and about context, having been in certain parts of the world where the term Christianity, the term evangelicalism is actually a bad term, especially here in America where it's becoming more anti-Christianity, anti-Christian. So what I'm asking, is it helpful to use those terms? Is it helpful to use evangelical, the word evangelical? And both terms are not highly biblical terms anyways. And so why are we fighting so much for these terms when we can just do away with them and just do something else? I don't know.
Yeah, I would, if we could, I would. If we could do away with the term Christian, I mean, the Bible has this little throwaway line, and they were called Christians in Corinth for the first time. Comes out of Acts 13. Boy, that thing's been hanging on for a long time, that Christian term. If we could drop that, I'd be totally up for it, right? Followers of the way of Jesus, or
full, go to church at all.
Or full humans. Drop the word church, drop the construct. I'd be all for that. I think the synagogue model of churches should have expired a long time ago. If we could drop evangelicalism, I'm 100% with you. I just don't see it happening. And they continue to carry power. And as long as there's power in that name, see my plan, Jesus, power in the name of Jesus, then I feel an obligation. I'm not saying anyone else does. I feel an obligation as someone who's professionally engaged at a public level in Christianity in North America, that for me to step away from those terms is to cede that power to people who want to do something else with it. So for me, this is about justice and about how those terms carry power to a lot of people who don't know that they could drop the term. They don't know that that's something that they could walk away from. It's embedded in their lived experience so deeply, they can't shake it. So they need to do what in narrative therapy a lot of people have to do to find some kind of healing from their own traumatic experience. They have to transcend and include in a way for them to find growth. And if we could just have let it slide away and be something that doesn't need to be rekindled, I agree. I think that would be much better. I don't self-identify as a Christian. Like I don't walk up and say that. Somebody's certainly not evangelical. Solomon's Porch that I'm a part of, we don't even call it a church. We call it a holistic missional Christian community. And I say, like, we're places where we try to thrive for the fullness of the new humanity that Jesus called for. And people are like, oh my God, man, can you just stop with all the, like, that's super jargony. And people are like, do you like pastor at church? I just saw this great little YouTube video with this comedian last night, and she said, do y'all run into those places that are like called The Rock? They're like in a community center, and someone invites you to like a clean, and you get there and you're like, it's a church. Like, stop hiding behind your Jimi Hendrix font, people. You're killing me. Like, I don't want to go to church, and you keep trying to trick me into it. There's this other pushback that when what you're really talking about is the Jesus agenda, when you're really talking about the fullness of God that manifests in all people, and you want to talk about the love that, and people are like, hey, you were hiding behind this by calling it missional and all this other language. But that's my tendency to do that. So like I started a holistic missional Christian community called Solomon's Porch, and I say, well, people are like, oh, dude, that's you're too clever by half. So this is the struggle that I find myself in, is which is more useful. And maybe if you've got a pathway forward, I'll follow you wherever it is.
Power, the one who used the term evangelical Christian. That's where you want to have your influence in, right?
Yeah.
So I want to underscore this. It sounds like what you're saying is because it's still a salient social identity, and people are either trapped by or oppressed by the affiliation or the belonging, there's still ministry to be done to people who identify as evangelicals to show them that there's another way of being Christian. Is that right?
And if because of our context, and truly I would have thought this would be different by now, last 30 years, I really did. If people said, oh, I like what you're talking about, that you want to bring a group of people together and you want to tell these stories and you want to impassion the holiness in every person to live and thrive, and the people aren't like, dude, you're just literally tricking me because that's what everybody else calls a church, and you're just using jargon to trick. I wish that wasn't the case in the United States where I live, and maybe in 25 years it's going to be different. I'm terrified that it's not. And we have to figure out another path rather than trying to say, I'm spiritual but not religious, emerging faith kind of person following in the way of Jesus that wants to use ancient traditions of spirituality. And people are like, you literally read to me out of the book of John, and you use the word grace and free, and just changing the lingo without changing the cultural category. I've now come full circle. I'm like, I don't think that's very honest. I think for me, I've got to be a little more honest and say, okay, if you're triggered by Christian stuff, I'm going to trigger you, because the community I have is kind of Christian-y. I think it's better than other expressions, at least better for me. It fits me a lot better. I like it. This is a different thing. It's fusion food that's different. You know, it's not, every hamburger is not the same. Every restaurant's not the same. But in the end, I'm pitching a timeshare, and if you didn't want a timeshare, and I tricked you, got you to a place, and I offered you a TV set, and then I pitched you on a timeshare. Some people are like, good, I actually wanted a timeshare. That's great. I was looking for one. Couldn't tell if you guys were really about timeshares. So that's what I've come to. I'm cynical about my cynicism now, to the point that I just need to tell people I'm a progressive Christian.
Okay, I'm going to call it. This is our last one right here, so please.
Oh, yeah, I think I'm just trying to, as I'm listening to everybody, I'm connecting everything. I think, you're talking about, is it helpful, what is it? I think, and, we're talking about, all these people kind of fighting over evangelicalism. My sense is what's at stake is, what exactly is the gospel? What exactly is the gospel? I mean, that's basically what exactly is the church? And everyone, in these categories, like, the gospel is the 4 spiritual laws. And it's like, no, the gospel is social justice. Oh, no, the gospel is X. And maybe what we're really, in the way that we're fighting about what the gospel is through this term, evangelicalism, which is, good news. But, what do we mean by salvation? What do we mean by church? So I think maybe that's what's, at the end of the day, what this whole fight is about. And I have a really funny example is I recently met this person from like a Chinese megachurch here. So the church collectively, between the church and all the individuals, they gave millions to Hillary Clinton. But when the election time came, they all voted Trump.
What?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
They said, that's what he said to me. He's a Democrat. He goes, as a church, we were like we donated lots of money to the Hillary campaign, but when it came time to vote, we felt that, the most Christian thing to do was to vote for Trump.
Probably on a particular issue, maybe abortion.
Yeah, or whatever it is. And so, how do you make sense of that? And it goes back to, I think, what exactly is the gospel? And if to you the gospel means pro-life, being heterosexual, or whatever it is, then you're going to vote for a certain candidate. And so again, then the question, so what exactly is the gospel?
So let me frame this in closing for both of you to answer. The stakes are high. The question can be as large as, what is the very gospel? So for you, on this question of retrieve or retract, what is the central concerning issue or stake for you? What's at stake for us?
For me, it is not to really engage so much in the conversation about evangelicalism, where this is something that is a priority, in Doug's life. My commitment and the focus of other people may categorize us that way, but is to develop the actual experience of a wider community of faith structured around commitments that are clear, but few. And to create a community that is permeable with faith experience for movement, as a pilgrim church.
Love it.
And to put that at the center of our work together, to engage globally and to continue to engage globally. And by that I mean cultures here and cultures around the world, to not be limited. We have not be limited by our own little orbits of experience, but to speak and listen across those lines, number one. So that global, interaction with global migration, with the global church, to put let our hearts be broken, for other people. And then to promote healthy churches. These expressions in different churches and how they, what they call themselves and what font they use and how they, all of this is a part of our ecosystem that is real. But so how do we promote healthy churches? How do we provide the new minister, first call, 5 years, we're going to support that woman when she goes into ministry and not let her fall, whatever her path is. How do we make sure that that seminary student that needs a scholarship gets one and doesn't walk out the door with $100,000 in debt? How do we protect and care for that incarnational ministry? So these, the gospel, the real gospel is this commitment to global engagement and to promoting, as best we know how, the incarnational ministry in the local church, and then to promote young experimenters, innovators, people trying in this innovative space and through, experiments like greater good. How do we support this culture of innovation with the hope and the trust that, some people are going to fall off the cliff, but other people are going to take root, and it's going to be like the parable of the soils. So can I just be, a farmer and hope that I'm giving good soil for these things? And when I listen to that parable and I think about what's my responsibility in a church community, it is to just try to provide good soil, because I just believe God is casting seed like that. I grew up in Texas on a ranch, and my dad wanted to build a dam and make a lake. So he piled up all this dirt. And there were 5 of us, and he gave us all these little canvas things that we hung around our neck. And it had a whirligig on it. It had a handle like this, and you put a whole bunch of seed in it, and you walked and you turned it, and it went clickety, 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 clack, and the seed went everywhere. And what I think about that when I hear that parable, this is God. He's walking around with this clickety clack hope, putting seed in your life, and your life, and your life, and your life. And can we be that both in Christianity? That is where we're going to find this fertility for the gospel. And I can't wait. I just can't wait.
Awesome.
You might have made some cooperative Baptists today.
Yeah. Doug, you're far more cooperative than Baptist part of that thing, isn't it? It doesn't sound like a Baptist. You're like, that's what we're cooperative Baptists. We're here to cooperate. I think there's a lot at stake. I would suggest that the narratives in the United States are deeply influenced by religious subtext. I think it's, to many people's chagrin, including mine, that's the case, but religion plays an enormous role in how people think, what we value, what our policies are, where our emphasis are, how we've organized. It has been for a long time and is deeply rooted. Our militarism is that way, white supremacy is that way, exclusion is built around these things, sexism totally rooted in religious narratives and religious reinforcements. I don't believe you can change those issues in the United States without addressing religion. I think it has to be. I think we've tried for 150 years to try to deal with religion, to not deal with religion and to address these issues. But at the core, what a friend mentioned tends to happen. Somebody will say, yeah, here's my politics. But when it comes right down to it, there's something that, we even talk about some Judeo-Christian sort of norm, which is a really insulting phrase on a lot of levels, especially to Jewish people who don't see it that way, and anyone who's not Jewish Christian. But it's deeply rooted. So I think you have to address religion in North America. I think if we're going to see the kind of social change, so what I want to do is affect the more common good in civic life and in faith, and I think that they go hand in hand if you're going to see this kind of change. So, and I don't believe you can change the religious narrative in the United States without changing the dominant religion, which is Christianity. And I don't think you can change Christianity in the United States without changing Catholicism and evangelicalism, whatever those terms mean. I can't affect Catholicism. Might have a little bit of influence inside of evangelicalism. So, to Martin Luther King's statement, if you have teeth, chew. If you don't have teeth, gum. And if you you just do what you can do. But I think the stakes are really high. I think the idea that we could move to some sort of a secular state in the United States as a culture is still a long way off. So I don't think it's something that religious people should get a pass on. I think we benefit from it. I think we run our nonprofits and churches off of it. I think we're totally extracting benefit and then acting like, I don't want to worry about it. I just want to worry about I just want to be a do-gooder. And then meanwhile, so I think we have to call religious leaders to say, hey, you're reinforcing a lot of narratives. And there's an alternative set of narratives that I think we need to be about, which are inclusion and the like. So I think it really matters. On this question of the gospel, I think the problem is in the definitive. And I think it's the use of the word. I think the biggest problem for us is the word "the" in the gospel. It's an English language problem, but it's also a cognitive category problem. If people had said, what is good news? And we got together and told about the good news as opposed to the good news and the gospel. But I'm telling you, there's a lot of people who are more committed to "the" than they are to gospel.
That's good.
And
that's good.
That's something that you have to really work at. Jesus was about this all the time. So I think there's a long tradition of prophetic voices that are trying to drop the and go for the good news. But for a lot of us, what we talk about isn't particularly good, or as my friend Samir says, it's not even news anymore. So if we're going to try to proclaim some sort of good news, it really ought to be, even if we drop the it really ought to be good, and it ought to be newsworthy, as opposed to, yep, heard that before. And so I would argue that dogma is the opposite of good and news. It's sort of locked in and what we already know and believe. So I think there's a lot to be done with good newsiness, but getting rid of the definitive is, and the definite article, I think, is the trick to that. And for a lot of people, so just one little anecdote. My friend, I have a friend who said, I left Christianity, he's in our community, he said, I left Christianity because I realized I got into it because people told me that it was an exclusive club of those who were loved by God and others weren't. And when I found out that it's not, what am I doing here? The only thing that made Christianity exciting for him was that it was an exclusive club. So I started saying, like, no, the whole point of it is to remind you that it's not an exclusive club. That's the Jesus teaching. It's not an exclusive club. That's why there's the Beatitudes and all that. He's like, well, then what am I doing in this thing? And then he found a way back in. He said, yeah, I kind of had to leave behind the faith that was rooted in exclusivism so that I could find a faith that's rooted in a Jesus expressed inclusivism. And that's a thing a lot of people are going through. So there's a lot of us who need to leave the faith that was binary